Well, I appreciate the invitation to be with you all today. Rick said about the length of the speech. Woodrow Wilson used to tell folks, they would ask him, how long of a speech are you going to give? And he'd say, well, how much time do I have to prepare? And he'd say, well, what if you needed to do it today? And he said, well, I can give an hour and a half long speech. And what if you got a week to prepare? Well, I can do, 30, 45 minutes. 2 weeks, I can do it in 10 or 15. So I'm happy to tell you all I've had 2 months to get this speech ready. So it's not going to be too long. What I want to spend most of my time doing, hopefully, is to hear your questions and concerns. I do want to say thank you to the sheriff for your service. I want to say thank you to Rick and the executive committee for what y'all do for the Republican Party. I've been a county party chairman. I know what a thankless job that can be, and I appreciate y'all carrying the banner for the Republican Party. I want to thank Dr. Austin for serving on the state committee. That is a tough job, and it is particularly tough when they're dealing with these issues where the party's trying to take some positions and stake out some ground. And I think that's an important function for the Republican Party to play. But I do want to congratulate the entire state committee on the position that they took with respect to the religious freedom issue. And John Watson, I can tell you, he's reached out to me. I know he's reached out to people from the entire spectrum of the Republican Party to try to bring the party together and have everybody working towards a common goal. So having said all of that, what I'd like to do today is talk to you about who I am, sort of where I come from, why I'm interested in public service, why am I running for Secretary of State, what I hope to accomplish in the Secretary of State's office, and then a little pitch about what I'd like from you in the way of helping me in this campaign, and then hopefully we can have some questions. So a little bit about me personally. My great-grandfather moved to Columbus, Georgia, to work in the Eagle and Phoenix textile mill. That's what brought him to Georgia and to Columbus specifically. He worked at the Eagle and Phoenix textile mill for 50 years, and it was a good place to work, helped provide for the family. My grandfather left school in the 8th grade during the Great Depression, worked a number of odd jobs in and around Columbus to help provide for the family until he enlisted and served in the Army in World War II. He moved. When he enlisted in the Army, he served in the Pacific Theater, came home after World War II. He married my grandmother. My grandmother worked at commercial printers in Columbus. My grandfather did a lot of different things. He was a milkman. He was a railroad conductor. He did a lot of different things. They put enough money together, and after a few years, they opened a grocery store at 5th Avenue and 8th Street in downtown Columbus. They had a grocery store. They had a filling station. They were entrepreneurial, small business people. My dad was the first member of our family to go to college. He worked in that same Eagle and Phoenix mill to help pay for tuition to Auburn University in the summers. And then he went on to law school. He's been in private law practice for the last 40 years, and I've followed in his footsteps. I went to Furman University, and then this is the part of the speech where most people kind of groan. I went to the University of Alabama for law school. But with both of my parents going to Auburn, that sort of counteracted that. But I tell you all that to say my family has enjoyed, because of being in Georgia, in America, we have enjoyed what I think we all think of as the American dream. Each generation's done a little bit better than the one before. And what got me interested in politics and getting into public service was that I saw that becoming harder and harder for new generations and for younger people to achieve because of our government. The government stands in the way a lot of times of people's ability to control their own destiny. And we can talk about a lot of different ways that happens, but that is what motivated me to get into public service. So I did want to give you just a little bit of personal background on me. The big new thing in my life is a year ago, August 20th, I got married to Jacqueline, the former Jacqueline Bird. The years really flown by. It's hard for me to believe we've been married for over a year now. But it's been wonderful, and I'm enjoying things right now, and had made the decision not to seek re-election to the state senate. I've been in the state senate representing District 29, which is a little bit south of here. It's Muskogee, Harris, Meriwether, and Troup counties. This is going to be my final term. I'd made that decision before getting in this race because, frankly, I had decided I was ready to do some new things, some different things. My mother got diagnosed in 2015 with pancreatic cancer. She passed away 15 weeks to the day from her diagnosis. And that makes you think about the time that you're spending, what are you doing with your life, and examining that, I decided to leave the Senate and really thought I was going to take a break from elected politics. So why am I running for Secretary of State? I'm running for Secretary of State because I want Georgia to be the fastest state in the nation to get a job, and I want it to be the toughest state in the nation to cast an illegal vote. So if you remember nothing else that I tell you today, that is what I'm setting out to do as your next Secretary of State. So let me talk first of all about the jobs part, because I think people wonder, well, the Secretary of State, don't they just sort of deal with corporations and election administration? That's true, those are things the Secretary of State does, but the Secretary of State also is over a number of licensed professions. And you know, 40 years ago in this country, 1 in 20 Americans had to go get a license to go to work. They had to go get essentially permission from the government to be able to go work in their chosen field. Today, that is 1 in 3. 1 in 3 Americans have to get a license of some kind to be able to work in their chosen field. Now, here in Georgia, what's happened, in my opinion, is that we have gone way too far in the direction of throwing up artificial barriers to people being able to go to work. To give you an example, a cosmetology license holder, this is someone who's received a license to cut and color hair, on average receives 350 days of training before they get that license. By contrast, an EMT, on average, somebody that's going to come to your home if you have a medical emergency, they've received on average 31 days of training before they are licensed. So that should tell you there is something wrong with the structure that we've put in place. And you know, we talk all the time about Georgia being the #1 place to do business, and that's something we should be proud of. It's something, over the last 4 years, I've heard that enough that if I had $1 for every time I heard it, I could self-fund my campaign for Secretary of State. But there's another side to this story, and that is what is happening with low-income and middle-income people in our state. Georgia State University conducted a study, and they found we've gone from 33rd in the nation to 41st in the nation for our proportion of middle-income families. At the same time, we've gone from 21st to 15th for low-income families. So what that tells me is that while we've got businesses oftentimes bringing their corporate headquarters to the metropolitan Atlanta area, and that's creating jobs, and that's a very good thing, for people who are trying to reach for that first rung on the ladder to economic success, things are getting harder for them. It's not getting easier for them. And so one of the things that we can do without taking a dime of anybody's tax money to subsidize an industry or play favorites by passing laws for special interests, we can simply roll back some of these artificial barriers to hard work. So as your Secretary of State, what I want to do is I want to ask the following questions about each and every licensed profession. Number one, is there some sort of public interest that requires us to be in a situation where we make somebody ask permission from the government to do this job? Now, sometimes the answer is absolutely going to be yes. There are public safety and public health issues that are implicated with a number of these licensed professions. But you can just look at some of the licensed professions we've added in the few years to see that we're not always doing that. In my time in the General Assembly, we have created a state licensure process for music therapists. We have created a state licensure process for lactation consultants. Now let me just tell you this, those industries already certified those folks. There was a process in the private marketplace that would let you know as a consumer, this person's received the appropriate training, they've done what they need to do. What we were told at the General Assembly is, well, the only way the insurance companies are going to pay for this is if there's a state licensure process. Well, our reaction to that shouldn't be, okay, let's create a new bureaucracy. It should be, let's figure out what law we need to pass that's going to require the insurance companies to pay for these healthcare providers if they're properly certified by their governing agency. So we need to ask that question, is every license out there necessary? And then for the ones that are, we need to ask, is there a way we can help people get into this business? I was talking to a young lady yesterday up in Roswell, Georgia, who has a friend that's getting ready to sit for the cosmetology exam. All she wants to do is cut hair, but there's a whole part of the process about dealing with people's nails and pedicures and manicures and all that. Well, she doesn't want to do that. So maybe we could create a licensure process that's modular where she can just get the hair part. Why as conservatives do we want to throw up barriers to connecting people to the dignity of honest hard work? So to me, job one as Secretary of State is to address that issue. Americans for Prosperity has done a nationwide study, and they have found that if we would implement licensing reform around the country, 5.4 million additional people would be put to work. So you think about what that would mean for Georgia alone, and doesn't involve spending your tax money, raising taxes. It just is getting the government out of the way of people controlling their own destiny and their own future. So I think that is job one for the next Secretary of State. Now, to talk a little bit about the Corporations Division. For those of you who have ever had an occasion to organize a limited liability company or a corporation, you have to go through the Secretary of State's office here in Georgia to do that. You file some paperwork, and then you get a certificate back from the Secretary of State's office. We still have significant problems with the delivery of these services online. If you go into the office in downtown Atlanta, you generally don't have a problem. You can get the turnarounds pretty quick. But I had a situation just a few months ago. A client needed an LLC for a real estate transaction. We filed the appropriate paperwork. We paid the $100 filing fee. We paid the $250 expediting fee that was supposed to guarantee it would be ready by noon the next day. Noon comes around, no certificate. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. My client's got to have this the following morning. So finally I call the office. I'm greeted by someone who is not interested in helping me, who does not have the sort of customer service attitude any of us would have at our businesses if we had a customer calling us. And finally, I had to say to the person, I have Secretary Kemp's cell phone number. My next call is going to be to him if this is not addressed. And then it got fixed within about 11 minutes. That should not be how that works. We should have a process where the employees in the Secretary of State's office want to go out of their way to be helpful and have the same kind of customer service attitude any of us would expect from any private business. So I'm going to work with the stakeholders that deal with this office day in and day out, transactional lawyers, business people. We're going to see what the bottlenecks are both on the technology side, but also on the human resources side, and we're going to address those issues so that you're able to have a smooth process and you're able to get the work done in a reasonable time in a reasonable fashion. Now, the thing that I think is probably the most exciting issue, or the one I get the most questions about, has to do with the administration of elections. Obviously, the most important thing that the Secretary of State does in terms of a constitutionally mandated duty is to make sure that we have an elections process that is fair and that is easy for people to navigate. So let's talk for just a moment about that. Right now, we have a situation where the voting machines that we all use, and for anybody in here who votes early or who votes on election day, you know I'm talking about these touchscreen, debold electronic voting machines that you see at your precinct or at your early voting location. Those machines are coming up on the end of their usable life cycle. There's some counties that have replaced theirs, but some counties who have the ones that are there from when Kathy Cox was Secretary of State, they're getting to the point where they're not going to be usable anymore unless there's serious servicing done or they're replaced with new units. So that means the next Secretary of State is going to have to work with the governor and the General Assembly to come up with a voting solution. A lot of people talk about a paper audit trail or some verifiable way to make sure the vote you cast was properly counted. And there's a real concern when it comes to recounts, because if there's a close election, how do you really do a recount on an electronic voting machine? So what I'm pledging to everyone, I'm not going to tell you that there's this Model X machine out there that's the solution, because I haven't seen that. What I will tell you is we need an open and fair process. That is not what happened when the Diebold machines were acquired. There was a decision made, we're going to buy this type of machine, and then a decision-making process was designed to reach that result. And we need to have an open process where the General Assembly is being consulted, the governor is being consulted, but most importantly, that local elections officials are part of that process, because the Secretary of State is not the one standing in the precinct when voters appear to cast their ballots. That's the local elections officials, the local boards of election. So we need to have an open process, a competitive bid process that everyone can participate in, and we need to understand this is not going to happen overnight. We need to have this timed so that we acquire these machines in an off year, that they can be tested, that they can be used then for the first time in off-year elections, and that we don't really have a significant election for 18 months after the machines have been acquired. So anybody that tells you they're going to run in immediately, change all the technology, and make all these changes, you need to ask them, well, are you going to make sure you're getting the input you need? Are you going to make sure we're getting the best deal we can get for the taxpayers? And so for me, everything's on the table when it comes to voting machines, but the main thing is that we have that open process. The Secretary of State needs to be willing to defend Georgia election law. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Now, I assume here in Carrollton, y'all are aware of the special congressional election that took place a few months ago. Maybe you saw some television commercials, John Ossoff, Karen Handel. Well, during that race, people on the far left who know they can't change Georgia election law at the General Assembly, because we control the General Assembly, we control all the statewide constitutional offices. They have a new strategy, and the strategy is to run to an Obama-appointed federal judge and get that judge to rewrite election law in the middle of an election. That's what happened in the Karen Handel-John Ossoff race. The election was on April the 18th. The runoff was on June 20th. Georgia law is very clear. You can't register anybody to vote 30 days out from an election. Now, why is that? That is so that we are able to verify that people are who they say they are and that we have an accurate voter roll on the day of the election. So what happened? The left ran to court and said, this doesn't need to be March 19th, 30 days before the April election. It needs to be May 21st, 30 days before the runoff, because that runoff that's another election. Well, that's just not true, y'all. I mean, who in here has ever taken a Republican primary ballot? Probably everybody. When you go to the runoff, they're not going to let you vote in a Democratic Party runoff, because it is a continuation of the earlier election. So what happened in this lawsuit? The Democrats ran to court. The Obama judge, unsurprisingly, extends the deadline. And then the state of Georgia says, oh, well, too bad. We're just going to roll over. And the Democrats registered 10,000 additional voters during that extra time that judge gave them in contravention of Georgia law. Now, there's a reason that there's an 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and there's a reason there's a United States Supreme Court. And that is when we get a bad result that's wrong on the law, we take it up on appeal so it can be corrected. This is where, and I know people sometimes groan when they say, talking about, well, as a lawyer, I'll say this or that. But as somebody who's practiced election law and interacted and dealt with these statutes, I can tell you there are sometimes we've got to plant the flag and say, we're going to defend this, and if the left wants to attack it, they're going to have to pack a lunch, because we're going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they're going to have to tell us that there's a problem with Georgia election law. So that's something that I think is incredibly important about your next Secretary of State, because The Democrats were willing to spend $30 million on a single congressional race. The next Secretary of State will be Secretary of State in 2020 when Donald Trump is on the ballot for re-election. Imagine what the left is going to be willing to do to try to alter the results of that election. You don't need somebody that's going to shrink away from a fight. You need somebody who's going to stand tall and stand up for the position taken by your legislators who you've elected to go do the people's business. Yes. One related issue on these legal concerns. There are 2 counties that were sued last year, and the lawsuits were to force those counties to print ballots in languages other than English. Now, let me be really clear about this. I think it is wonderful that our country and our state has a long tradition of welcoming immigrants from all over the country, people that have gone through the process and have followed the rules to come pursue their own American dream. But when you're talking about engaging in the political process in this country, it is not too much to ask that people understand English well enough to vote. And that's a position. And that's a position I'm going to defend as your Secretary of State. And I'm also going to do something else that I don't think has been done in a while. You know, we have a Republican president now. I think everybody in this room is probably aware of that. We ought to be working with President Trump and the Congress to make some changes at the federal election law level to address some of these problems, because most of the time the lawsuits that are coming are based on federal law. But that doesn't mean we just throw up our hands and say, oh, too bad. It means we roll up our sleeves, we go to Washington, D.C., and we say, look, you need to let Georgia run Georgia elections. You know, that's what Republicans are about. Lowest level of government, closest to the people. The last elections matter I'll mention to you that's sort of legally related is this. We have these groups. New Georgia Project is one of them. They take money from these leftist donors from around the country, and they attempt to have these voter registration drives. I'm all for voter registration. I want people to be registered, and if they're legally entitled to vote, I want them to be able to vote. What I don't want is for us to have fraudulent registrations flooding local offices in an attempt to game our system and allow illegal votes to be cast. And what I want you to know is that these groups who are out there, this is how they pay folks. They don't say, hey, I'm going to pay you $10 an hour to go up and down this neighborhood and register people to vote. They say for every registration you turn in, we're going to pay you $10. They pay a bounty for each registration that gets turned in. So imagine what that does. That creates this enormous incentive to just generate as many registrations as possible, whether they're valid or not. I want to tell you a quick story about that. There was a young man who was in Columbus for a travel ball tournament. He lived in another state, lives in another state. He was just turning 18. One of these organizers approached his grandfather who'd brought him and said, we need you to register to vote. And they said, well, we live in another state. We're sorry, we can't. Oh, that's no problem. We can take your information and we'll register you to vote in your state. So he went ahead and he filled out the paperwork. It comes time, he's from Ohio, it comes time for him to vote, right? And so he's getting ready to get prepared and he calls the office to find out about his precinct and everything. Oh, well, you're not registered to vote in Ohio, you're registered to vote in Georgia, because they had turned it in to the office there in Columbus. And because of the delay, he missed his opportunity to vote in his first presidential election last year. So if you don't think this is causing problems with our system, so the Secretary of State needs to work with the legislature to ban that. It should not be legal to pay a bounty on voter registrations. You want to pay people by the hour to go do that? Have at it. But we shouldn't have this bounty. A lot of other states have made that illegal as well. The last thing I'll mention to you is about voter fraud. Democrats like to say all the time, oh, there's no voter fraud. Voter fraud doesn't happen. I will tell you, in 2014 in Muskogee County, we had a situation where a woman presented herself in the elections office with an unsealed envelope with 19 absentee ballots filled out. And she was asked, you know, because as it happened, a member of our Board of Elections was there that day. And he said, what are you doing with all these ballots? And she said, oh, well, I work at this nursing home in town, and I just wanted to bring these by for the convenience of the residents, et cetera. So they figured something was up, so they separated those ballots out, and they went and said, okay, who are these people? Let's go interview them and find out what's going on. So they go out to the nursing home. A majority of those 19 ballots were being cast by people who were catatonic in the nursing home. They did not have the capacity to make a mark on a piece of paper, much less sign their name or vote a ballot. And all 19 ballots were thrown out. But no one was prosecuted. There was no investigation beyond what the Board of Elections did. Now, the Secretary of State's office does have a law enforcement division that is there to investigate these type of issues. But it has been historically underfunded. There's very few personnel in that office. We need to have the legislature work with the Secretary of State to get an appropriate budget level so that there are enough of those folks so that when complaints come in, that the Secretary of State can send someone out to investigate those claims, because that is incredibly important. You can be sure, as long as there have been elections, there have been people trying to cheat. And so you got to have a Secretary of State who's willing to stand up. So the last thing I'll say to you on the campaign front is this. There are 4 of us running in the Republican primary. There are 2 state representatives, there's a mayor up in North Fulton, and there's me. So people ask me all the time, why you? Anybody can understand these issues, anybody can attack these problems. Well, the difference I would argue to you is this. Over the last 7 years I've spent in the state Senate, when an issue has come up, I have been willing to stand my ground and fight. When I ran in 2010, I ran on a platform of bringing ethics reform to the General Assembly and ending the practice of unlimited lobbyist gifts to members of the General Assembly. I got up there, I started to try to do it. I was told, you're going to be primaried, you're going to be sent home, this is never going to pass. 3 years later, we passed Georgia's first limitation on gifts to lobbyists. I didn't back down, I didn't step away from it. I made some people mad, but I did what I told the people of my district that I was going to do. We took on this religious freedom issue, and it's true, Governor Deal vetoed the bill that was passed in 2016, but we've seen every declared Republican candidate for governor has taken the position that they're going to defend your religious freedom if they're elected and sent to the governor's mansion in 2019. So I've demonstrated over the last 7 years, I don't just talk about these issues. When I commit to you, I stay committed and I will do what is necessary to get the job done. And to me, that's the difference, because the next Secretary of State is going to be under enormous pressure from the media and from the left. Oh, you need to play fair, which means giving in to every demand they make. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stand up for the rule of law. I'm going to stand up for the principles we believe in. So the last thing I'll mention to you is, because my friend Alton Russell, who some of you know, Alton taught me this, he's been in sales for 50 years, and he says, if you don't ask for the order, you don't get it. So there are 3 things I want to ask you for before I close. May 22nd is the Republican primary. I need your vote for Secretary of State. A lot of people will be voting for governor, lieutenant governor, other things, but we need your vote for Secretary of State on May 22nd. The second thing is we'd love to have you join our campaign. Matt Fuentes, who works with me, is sitting right over there. He's got a pad with him. We'd love to get your contact information so that we can keep you informed about what we're doing. The third thing I'll mention to you is this. We are looking for people to financially invest in this campaign. We expect this campaign to cost somewhere around $1 million to run this race. And I'm sad about that, but that's what it requires to be on television in a significant way around the state of Georgia. And so if you believe in what you've heard today and you're willing to sign up and join our campaign, I don't care what the level of investment is. I have a friend of mine, 20-year-long friend of mine, lives in St. Louis, Missouri, works at an Enterprise rent-a-car franchise, and he sent $5. My goal is to have the most donors. I'm not looking to have a bunch of people write $6,600 checks to this campaign, but we need people financially invested and financially committed. And if we do that, we're gonna win the race, because we'll be able to get the message out that you've heard here today. So I thank you for listening to this talk. I thank Rick for bringing a lawyer to speak to you and giving me a captive audience. That's a dangerous thing to do. If there's time, I'd be delighted to answer any questions, but thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
One area that doesn't get often mentioned, but it's the military and getting the returns, getting the votes from the military back and getting them counted in time.
Yeah, let me address that. So the question is about military and overseas voting. It is obviously of paramount importance. People who put on the uniform of the United States, who are defending our freedom overseas, be allowed to exercise their right to vote. And there are a couple of things I would say about that. Currently, we have a system, those of you who've been voting for a while will know, we used to have a July primary, late July primary, but we went to this May primary because there's a federal law that says if you don't have a plan in place, you got to have a 45-day window for each election. So that's why we now have a 9-week runoff, not a 3-week runoff. We have a number of solutions that we should and ought to proceed to make sure military voting occurs and occurs without any problems. Instead of necessarily relying on mail, there are a number of secure solutions that involve both telephone contact and online casting of ballots over a secure military channel. Other states do that. I've spoken to Pat Gartland, who is really an expert in this area up in Cobb County, and I'm talking to Pat about some different solutions we could pursue. But I am 100% committed, having a number of folks that serve at Fort Benning in my Senate district for the last 7 years. We are going to find the best way to securely allow people to cast those votes and not be worried under our current system, well, did it arrive in time by mail? Because right now, the system is an absentee ballot is mailed to the soldier wherever they are. They mail it back, and they're given until Friday. They're given a little bit longer than the regular vote. They're given until Friday when the certification occurs to arrive. But you're basically at the mercy of the U.S. Postal Service. So we ought to come up with a better solution. Other states have better solutions in place, whether it's secure online or this sort of hybrid with the telephone. I'm committed to working with everybody to implement that, hopefully in time for the 2020 presidential election.
Well, can you stay around a little after?
Sure, I'll be around.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.